They don't sit and cut off for a while. It's not like you count to 1, 2, 3, and then put them back. You go right to cut off, right back to run. Now, that procedure obviously was not done. There is never, ever in the history of commercial flight ever been a procedure where you take both fuel cutoff switches and put them to cut off and leave them there, especially not seconds after rotate. Now, one of the things that's bothered me in this whole scenario from the beginning was how quickly the ram air turbine, or the RAT, deployed. Shortly after takeoff, and I'm talking 4 or 5 seconds after takeoff, that RAT comes up. The RAT is there as a last resort in case there is a dual engine failure. And a dual engine failure normally takes some time to progress. Those big old engines need to spool down. It might take 30 to 60 seconds for them to completely fail to send the message to the RAT to deploy. It's designed to be something that happens at altitude, maybe 35,000 feet. Both engines flame out. They spool down. The RAT then deploys to give you electric, hydraulic. It doesn't give you any thrust, but it gives you enough to fly the airplane and shoot an approach when you get down and talk on a radio. Now, that RAT came out almost immediately. Why would that RAT come out so quickly? Because the whole flight didn't last more than 60 seconds. The only explanation is that both of those fuel control levers were placed to cut off. That would immediately deploy the RAT. The RAT now, the airplane is in what's called airborne logic as opposed to ground logic. What's the difference between those two? When the airplane is on the ground, there's weight on the wheels. There's a thing called a weight on wheels switch that tells the airplane it's on the ground. So, for instance, when I get to the gate and I instruct my co-pilot to turn both fuel control switches to cut off, I don't want the RAT to deploy. And it's not going to do that on the ground because the airplane knows that it's on the ground and the RAT will never be needed on the ground. Once I'm airborne and the weight comes off of those wheels, the airplane now reverts to the airborne logic in the computer, and it knows that I'm flying. If both fuel control switches were placed to cut off, maybe I'm doing the dual engine procedure, and then I'm going back to run, as soon as I go to cut off, boom, that RAT's going to deploy immediately because the airplane knows I need it. So at that point, when they were placed to cut off, the RAT came out. That explains why and how the RAT came out so quickly after takeoff in a short flight that didn't last even a minute. So that's the what of what happened. There was a dual engine loss. It was due to the fuel control switches being placed to cut off. Now, the next question is going to be, could that have been a mistake? Could that have been done inadvertently? No, the answer is absolutely not. The switches, even though they're called switches, are not like a light switch. It's not just a simple flip on and flip off switch. All of us have leaned against the light switch at some point and the lights went out. And we looked around and we went, oh, sorry. And we put the switch back on. That's not how these work. This is a switch that requires manipulation. You have to grab it with both fingers. It has a detent that holds it into the run position. So let's say we're going from cutoff to run. It's a spring-loaded switch, so we have to grab it, grasp it, pull it out, pull it up, and release it over the detents. That's how it goes to the run position, and then it stays there for the duration of the flight, unless, of course, there's an engine failure and you need to bring it back to the cutoff position. But taking it from run to cutoff is also that same three-step procedure. You have to grasp it, pull it up over the detent, pull it down, and release it because it's spring-loaded to the cutoff position. At that point, when it's in the cutoff position, it will command the fuel valves at the engines to close. That'll cut off fuel in the engines, and the engines will then flame out at that point. The only way that that can be done is by a human being grabbing those fuel control switches and placing them in that position. There is no procedure, and there never has been any procedure or any mistake that's possible that those fuel control switches would be placed from run to cut off just after rotate on an aircraft. There just isn't. So that's the what of it all, and that's basically kind of the how of it all. According to these very reputable sources, that's exactly what happened. So now, with that being said, it takes us to another area that's very difficult for us to deal with, and that's the area of why would something like this take place. And we may never have an answer to that. To be quite honest with you, never have an answer to that. But we do need to delve into that because I think it's hugely important and it's a big question that's sitting out there that at least we need to try to attempt to answer. And that's where my other area of expertise comes in. I'm not just Captain Steve. who flies an airliner for a major airline, and I'm also Dr. Steve. And I've been a doctor now for, I think I had my doctorate about 15 years ago. But I've been a trained, experienced counselor for well over 30 years. And I've counseled thousands of people, families, individuals, couples, you name it. And quite honestly, I probably do more counseling at 37,000 feet in an airplane than I actually do on the ground, because pilots want to talk. And this is a very stressful job. And everybody, I think, understands that. There's a lot of responsibility. There's a lot of trust that's placed in pilots. It's an extremely stressful job. And how do you balance home life with your work life, especially when you're traveling as much as you do, and the fatigue that's involved, and the being away, and all of those things? It's a pressure cooker on a lot of pilots. I got interested in counseling about 35 years ago, and it was because of something that happened in the cockpit on a flight. Let me explain. I was an instructor in the Navy at the time, on active duty, and I was training students to earn their wings, and that's the most stressful, most extensive training any pilot gets on the planet, and it's designed to be stressful on purpose. If you're going to become a naval aviator, you're going to earn those coveted wings of gold, and we're going to make sure. I know that because I had gone through that program 8 years earlier as a student, and I earned my wings. Then 8 years later, now I'm an instructor, and I'm the guy that's instructing, or I'm delivering the stress to the students. I had two students that I've been flying with for about 7 days in a row. Excellent students, very good students, very good pilots. And I was on the last flight with them before I handed them off to their next phase of training. It was a very early morning brief. It was about 6 a.m. in the morning. We're sitting around the table talking, getting ready for their next evaluation. And the one student who had been excellent, he just was distracted. He wasn't there. It was hard to put your finger on. There was something wrong. We got out to the airplane. We took off. He was the first student in the seat. We get up to altitude. We're out in the operating area. We're going through some of the procedures, and he just is awful. I was like, wow, what are we going to do this guy? And at that moment, I just asked him a simple question, and I said, is everything okay? And when I said that, he just started to cry. I took the airplane from him. I said, look, my aircraft. I said, what's going on, man? And he explained to me that he had been up until about 3 o'clock in the morning on the phone with his father, who lived in the Midwest, and his father was attempting to commit suicide. His dad had a loaded gun in his lap, and this student, his son, had been talking his dad down off the cliff. Basically, he had been talking him out of committing suicide. He did so. His dad didn't kill himself, but now 3 hours later, he's in a brief trying to go fly an airplane. I said, oh my word, let's just call him Dave. Dave, you shouldn't be in an airplane right now. I said, Dave, here's what we're going to do. Here's how we're going to handle today. I said, we're going to go back. We're going to land. You and I are going to walk up to the ops boss. I'm going to explain to him that you need at least a week off. If you need more time, we'll get you that. You need to go take care of your family life and your dad and your own emotional well-being.